Finkelvitch with Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch on Times Radio.
Yeah, we're talking about the worst parties we've ever had. I think this is probably the best party you can have on a Tuesday morning. I'm joined by Finkelvitch. It's Daniel Finkelstein. Morning, Danny.
Good morning.
And beaming in from Aaronovitch Towers, it's David Aaronovitch. Morning, David.
Beaming literally, because why is it that the words interior designer always make me laugh?
It is so funny. I mean,
it's cake, wife, interior designers together, and it's almost like you have an episode of Absolutely Fabulous, isn't it, or something like it. It's kind of it's Jennifer Saunders falling drunk out of a taxi.
Well, talking of interior design, we can see your office there. You've got a cushion on your sofa. What does it say on the cushion?
It says a woman's place is in the White House.
Very good, very good. And what's that thrown over the back of your sofa?
That is the national flag of Albania.
Is this the work of Lulu Little?
It is. I asked her, can you give me something which is kind of eccentric but somehow kind of falsely intellectual? And she said, no problem at all. I've done work for Boris Johnson.
And that pile of sort of, what is that? Is that your gym kit? Dirty washing? What's that on the sofa? Is that all part of the installation?
No. It's not. It's not actually. It's part of lockdown stuff. Kind of elastic. Those bands you use for exercise and all that kind of stuff, which in lockdown we all had to do. Kind of for Zoom Pilates sessions. It's all that kind of stuff, and I don't know what to do with it because I'm worried if I throw it away, then we'll get locked down again. And so, actually, you shouldn't throw it away. You should, but then what I realise is I should have a party with it.
That's what you should do.
Kind of a lockdown Pilates party.
That's the sort of thing you want to go to, Danny. Let's talk about. We're not going to talk about parties. What I want to, I think, Danny, you suggested this. One of the arguments put forward by the Tory MPs who are trying to defend the Prime Minister right now. I think James Gray was making this point in the FT today. Is that with everything going on in the world, with Ukraine and Russia and so on, now would be a terrible time to remove Boris Johnson.
Yes, it's the usual argument about having leadership elections is this is a terrible time. So it's too close to the last election and the Prime Minister still has a mandate. It's too close to the next election, which means if we change the law, change the leader, there'll be an election. Or we shouldn't do it now because if we do it now, there'll be an election. The other variant of it, which isn't electoral, is this is a moment of crisis. It's the same thing, by the way, when people go on holiday, when Prime Ministers go on holiday. Every year there's something that means they should be back. And the reason for that is that if you're the Prime Minister, things happen all the time. So this it doesn't seem to me a particularly strong argument that we should continue with crisis-ridden leadership we don't trust, because we might need that crisis-ridden leadership we don't trust to fight a war. And in previous occasions, we've done it in the middle of these things, as we did indeed with the Gulf War, for example. That's exactly when Margaret Thatcher fell.
And that's the point, isn't it? The Margaret Thatcher went and John Major took over precisely while Iraq was erupting. And
and sometimes, by the way, as indeed was the case with Theresa May's resignation, it was necessary because of the big issue. But in other cases, it's just secondary to it. A lot of things in politics, it's not the perfect moment because there isn't such a thing as the perfect moment. It just is the moment. So, of course, it would be better if this didn't coincide with all sorts of other big issues, but it just does, and there's nothing to be done about it.
I suppose, what do you think, Dave? Is there ever a good time to change leaders?
Well, I presume that the same people are not saying, actually, we should have done it a month ago. That would have been a better time, and we're remiss in not having had a leadership election a month ago. But now we've waited too long. It's a particularly bad time. In other words, Dan's absolutely right. It's just a kind of cover for we don't want a leadership election because we're dependent upon Boris Johnson, or at least we've got to say we don't want a leadership election until there is one. At which point we all stand for it, or we all declare candidates, and we all declare ourselves incredibly happy that our candidate would actually make a very good job of this situation. And Dan is completely right. I mean, there is a very, very big argument for really just getting on with this leadership election, for getting rid of Boris Johnson. I mean, what you could say is trust in him is so scant now that almost any significant figure in the Conservative Party would actually have more respect than Boris Johnson would have, and therefore that's a very good reason for getting on and doing it. You just have to do it fairly quickly. That's all. I mean, with a kind of degree of rapidity. Well, I mean, that would have been an argument for keeping the old MP system, because that was a very quick system. I like the DUP system, where they only have about 14 people get to vote. And so actually, I don't really like it, but at least it provided.
But they do have the advantage of
results.
there not being very many of them. Danny, Kevin's been in touch saying, should Winston Churchill have waited till the end of World War II before launching his leadership bid?
Yeah, well, that was a bit like the other one that I mentioned, the Theresa May one. It was caused by the big issue.
Yeah.
But clearly, having the ability to have new leadership can sometimes be a big advantage in crisis as well as a big disadvantage. Yeah. The crucial point to understand is there's never a moment when the Prime Minister's not doing anything, where it's not, if, for example, this had happened a year ago, you could have said, well, we can't change the Prime Minister because we're in the middle of the COVID crisis.
Yeah.
And as I say, in a year's time, you could be saying, well, we can't change the Prime Minister, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. There's always a big challenge. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to bother thinking about who the Prime Minister was, because it wouldn't matter that much. The reason it matters that much is because there are these constant issues. And of course, it's better if there's a sort of moment of total calm when you're making these decisions. But probably if there was a moment of total calm, you wouldn't bother with it because everything would be calm.
Well, exactly. We're in the middle of a Prime Minister legitimacy crisis. That's the crisis we're also in the middle of. And until you solve that, it's quite difficult to really take on the other crises.
I think it's very important to understand, because several people have said, and I've had to think about it, because I shouldn't just automatically dismiss it. We shouldn't be going on and on about effectively a birthday cake and we've got all these big crises. The reason why things like the birthday cake matter, and they've been given the prominence they have, is because these huge issues require trustworthiness, integrity, a confidence that Downing Street will follow the law, a belief that the right people are being employed on the Prime Minister's staff. It's because of the big issues that these things matter. Of course, a cake isn't the issue. The issue is whether or not Prime Ministers need to follow the rules that they set. And of course, that matters in the case of Ukraine. What are we doing in the issue with Putin? We're disputing about liberal democratic norms and how broadly they should follow. Why would we bother doing that if we ignore the question of liberal democratic norms in our own country? So it isn't right to say all these parties are such a trivial issue compared to Ukraine. They're all part of the same thing, which is the preservation of liberal democratic norms.
There's also, David, an element of with the Russia-Ukraine. Britain isn't doing anything. And we're putting out statements saying we're very cross about it, but nobody really thinks that Britain, unless you buy into the idea that Britain is one of the great military powers in the world and we're going to go and stand up to, we're going to launch a counter-invasion. That's not happening, is it? This idea of Britain being one of the joint policemen with America, that's not. Boris Johnson's not playing a part in it anyway. It's not like he's got Putin on the phone on the speed dial.
Yeah, Britain's not a joint policeman, Matt, but actually I do think that the position that Britain takes up is important, and not just because I'm a Brit. I don't say it's the most important or anything like that, but it's as important as the position taken up by France and Germany, and those are important positions to be taken up. And I do think they're important matters of policy, and our diplomacy is part of the diplomatic package, and what we do and what we advise and what we jointly discuss is of actually real significance. And that's what makes me worried about the current situation is really how can somebody like Boris Johnson undistractedly deal with a crisis like this. It's a very big argument for a rapid leadership change. And the problem which is being put in our way over this is the idea that you can't do it rapidly. You can only do it slowly, and therefore you're going to have a period of when no one can do anything, of stasis, really. So actually, Matt, although I don't, I don't like that kind of business of saying, that kind of boosterism, with the biggest in the world, with the best in the world, and so on. I do think we have some importance.
Well, we'll see how we'll see what happens. As Steve Swinford, Times' political editor, has just reported, Sue Gray is now expected to wait until the police carry out their investigations before publishing a report. There's concern that publishing the report would effectively prejudge the police investigation. So
Which is why the Tory party should act now,
Which
by
is-
the way. I mean, if they possibly could, but they won't. But that's why they should actually go quick. The whole business of waiting for the Sue Gray report is a disaster for them. It's an absolute disaster. It's bad for the country, but it's really bad for them.
So we've gone from wait for Sue Gray to wait for the police to wait for Sue Gray, and that's going to go on for even longer, Danny.
It will. Yeah, I think this is a very regrettable decision. But the whole thing of waiting for Sue Gray was, in any case, a tactic. It seems to me that there's a great degree of clarity over the fact that the Prime Minister was attending a party that wasn't a work event in his own garden. There's a great degree of clarity over the fact that that wasn't within the regulations. And there's a great deal of clarity that Downing Street held a large number of events, each of which were held by the Prime Minister's staff, for whom he is accountable and responsible. So we know the crucial things. What she will rule on will give us a bit more detail. It may give us a little bit of sharpness on questions of rules, but I think we know the basic facts, and it's debilitating to wait further. I should point out that the people have been putting huge pressure on the Metropolitan Police to do what Cressida Dick has now announced, and they'll now be furious that she's doing it. And I've always been a bit uncomfortable about the operational decisions of the police being intervened in this way. I think we've now got ourselves into a tangle which was actually entirely predictable.
Let's move on.
Can we also now say, Danny, that there's also clarity about Boris Johnson having misled Parliament on this issue?
Yeah, I do think so. Yes, I don't. I mean, oddly, I don't think the birthday. Well, I don't call it a party, as it was the birthday gathering. I mean, I think whether it was a party is irrelevant. The birthday gathering, which was not within the rules, that I don't think that changes whether or not he told the truth to Parliament. But I just think it's obvious that he did understand that it was a social event to which he was going to in the garden, and I just have never really believed that particular suggestion.
Well, let's just turn our attention, because people are getting in touch saying, why are you talking about cake? Let's talk about somebody who has resigned. With some drama. Lord Agnew, who I don't need to tell you, was a Treasury and Cabinet Office Minister. This is what he did yesterday.
Schoolboy errors were made, for example, allowing over 1,000 companies to receive bounce-back loans that were not even trading when COVID struck. I've been arguing with Treasury and BEIS officials for nearly 2 years to get them to lift their game. I have been mostly unsuccessful. It is my deeply held conviction that the current state of affairs is not acceptable. Given that I'm the Minister for Counter Fraud, it feels somewhat dishonest to stay on in that role if I'm incapable of doing it properly, let alone defending our track record. It is for this reason that I've sadly decided to tender my resignation as a Minister across the Treasury and Cabinet Office with immediate effect.
It was quite a moment, Danny. Do you know Theo Agnew?
I do, yes, because he was a trustee of Policy Exchange, the think tank, and I was its chairman. I think very highly of him, and indeed there was a moment when his name came into the frame and people said, no, Tories have appointed a donor to do this job, and I said, no, I think he's a person of great integrity and force in my experience. Also, not much patience with people being incompetent, so I'm not this is quite in character, but he's a person who I think has a deep sense of right and wrong, and I think it will have frustrated him greatly that he couldn't get people to take action, that he was being given sort of political answers, because he's not a politician. It's an interesting thing, this. I wonder what David thinks. I think Theo Agnew's appointment is a bit of a justification for putting people in who are not just merely politicians. Probably a politician would have put up with this. And you've got two things, a plus and a minus. The plus is the politician probably wouldn't have resigned. They'd have carried on trying to do the job. We've now lost a very effective person because he got fed up with it. But on the other side of it, by bringing Theo Agnew into the government, we got somebody who didn't just fall for being given political soft soap, who was a bit tougher than that. I think it did show the value. People have questioned, I think, sometimes these bringing people in from outside. I'm not in favour of the idea that we had a businessman running the country, but I do think some of that experience is helpful in government, and he's probably demonstrated that. He's put up with less of what I think a politician probably would put up with.
It is an extraordinary moment. And we talked a lot about this on the show last week, David. The 4.3 billion pounds that was fraud that was just being written off. In his resignation letter, Lord Agnew said, Last week, a foolish decision was made to kill off the prospect of an economic crime bill in the third session. This would have enhanced our ability to tackle fraud with further savings of taxpayers' money. If my departure stimulates debate in these areas leading to coordinated action, it would have been a good day's work.
That was hopeful, wasn't it, on his part? Given everything else that's going on, I have to confess I'd never heard of this chap before he resigned. Obviously, from what Danny's been saying, I should have done. I certainly don't take a theological view about whether or not you bring in outside expertise to be ministers via a second chamber, even if I don't like the way in which the second chamber is composed, and even if the value of it is enormously diminished by the sheer number of people who are in it at the moment, despite all, in fact, its own pleas that it be slimmed down. And I think it would be consistent with that position if at least 200 peers were to voluntarily say, well, actually, we shouldn't be peers and we're not doing very much and we should go away now. And that would certainly help my confidence in somebody like Lord Agnew being appointed to the job he's being appointed, because that would give me confidence it wasn't a reward to some kind of place person, because frankly, the appointments to the House of Lords in the course of the last couple of years are beyond disgraceful, some of them, beyond disgraceful. And I think they really have, what's that lovely word they use in times, is besmirched, I think. Besmirched the reputation of the Lords.
Well, luckily, the Lord is in our presence. His reputation is still fully intact. Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch, lovely to speak to you as ever.